Okay, a few words about the factors that influence pulmonary ventilation. First factor, you may remember, is the resistance of the airways. Resistance is usually low. Why? Well, it's air. Airways well lubricated, they're usually wide, they open, so that will maintain resistance low. Second really important factor is surface tension. So imagine that this is an alveolus. On the inside of the alveolus is fluid. So, as you may know from your experience with the soap bubbles tend to collapse. And they tend to collapse due to the surface tension of the fluid. So that water, that liquid inside of the alveolus, pulls it, tries to collapse it. Now, interestingly enough, the more you inflate the alveolus, the stronger those forces are. So, just like with the elastic band, the farther you pull the elastic band, the more it resists the stretching. The farther you pull the walls of the alveoli when you inhale, the higher the surface tension is going to be. So in order to reduce that surface tension, we do have surfactant, which is produced by type 2 alveolar cells. And what essentially surfactant does, it reduces surface tension. So let's put it in the perspective of a scheme. Those are two alveoli of the same size. So this is the alveolus with no surfactant. This is the alveolus with surfactant. So in the alveolus with no surfactant, the forces that pull it to the center, the forces that aim to collapse the alveolus, are quite considerable. In the alveolus with surfactant, these forces are much smaller. We can observe it in newborns, prematurely born newborns. They do not produce enough surfactant, and the alveoli collapse after each breath, so it's much harder for them to breathe. Eventually they start producing normally, but that's a problem. Now, we got the resistance of the airways, we got the surfactant. Now, the last factor to mention is the lung compliance. So basically it's how well the lung stretches in response to the pressure. So think you can compare it this way. So if you compare a tire and a balloon, from the perspective of a compliance, balloon is much more compliant. You blow in it and it expands. You blow in the tire, so compliance, higher compliance, lower compliance. You blow in the tire and it barely, you probably cannot inflate the tire without a really strong, powerful pump. So higher compliance corresponds to the situation when the lung stretches more in response to a certain change of pressure. So if we say that compliance is low versus high, and we apply, and that's the initial size of the lung. So in case of a high compliance, if we increase pressure by delta P, certain number, doesn't matter what number is, same for low and high. In high compliance, the lung will be like that. In the low compliance, it will be like that. So basically, the lung with a low compliance is much harder to inflate, but easier to deflate. Lung with a high compliance is much easier to inflate, but harder to deflate. What affects it? The lung tissue. Fibrosis, any inflammation that leads to the formation of scar tissue reduces the lung compliance. And here are just a few words about the structure of the respiratory membrane. So if this is alveolus, things to remember. So type 1 alveolar cell, or simple squamous epithelium, okay? We'll get back to the function. Then you have type 2 alveolar cells, so that's type 1, that's type 2. Type 2 alveolar cells produce surfactant, they're more cuboidal. And also on the surface of the alveoli, you may have a macrophage, alveolar macrophage, which removes the debris from the alveolus. So what is the function of type 1 alveolar cell? That simple squamous epithelium. Turns out that the basement membranes of the alveolar epithelium and the blood vessel epithelium, that's blood vessel, so here's blood, they are fused. There's one basement membrane here. So you can see that this barrier between the alveolus and the blood is very thin. This barrier is called a respiratory membrane. Gas exchange occurs across the respiratory membrane. So oxygen goes in the blood, CO2 gets out of the blood back in the alveolus. Now, it's really important to maintain the respiratory membrane thin, because when it becomes thicker, when it is inflamed, there's some kind of an infection, for instance, like a bacterial infection, or, lo and behold, a virus infection, a coronavirus infection. As a result of inflammation, fluid accumulates in the lungs, respiratory membrane thickens, and the gas exchange across the respiratory membrane goes down.